Senator Barnett.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I stand in support of the motion and to say some key words and thoughts to express my views, and that is that since September 11, 2001, there has been a paradigm shift in the way that we see security and we see relationships in terms of country to country and people to people in this global community in which we live. This was brought home face to face to the Australian people on October 12, 2002 in the shocking and terrible incident in Bali. We have a new world order in which we are now living, and that world order is one where insecurity prevails, and it is quite possible that that insecurity could grow and terror will become even more terrific and terrible in the months and years ahead if we do nothing. There has been a paradigm shift, a change in the way that we see ourselves in this world community, and not only for the United States as a result of September 11 and what happened in New York and Washington DC and Pennsylvania, and since that time with regard to the terrorist attempts to shut down the US Congress and the US community. What should be remembered, it wasn't just 3,000 lives that were lost on September 11, but and the 90 or more Australian citizens that were killed on October 12. But you see, from the terrorist perspective, they were thrilled. They were thrilled and pleased and celebrating that outcome. Saddam Hussein congratulated the terrorists in their actions, but their preference would have been that for, instead of just 3,000 lost or 90-odd lost, that there be 30,000 or 3 million lost of innocent lives. That's the type of community and the type of terrorism that we're facing. This is not simply a war against Iraq. I call it a war against Iraqism. It's a war against terror. And that's why I'm pleased to stand here. I'm humbled to stand here and honoured to be able to stand here to say that if we withdraw now, at this time, this will cause certainly an increase in insecurity and terror around the world for tomorrow. If we do nothing today, there will be an increase in insecurity tomorrow. Terrorism will reign. Now, there have been 12 years, the Iraqi regime have had 12 years to be contained, to act in accordance with the law and the UN resolutions that have been put, and there have been no less than 17, and they simply haven't been contained. There are some people and those in this chamber and elsewhere who say, give them more time. They've had more time. And the only reason they've been acting and allowing UN weapons inspectors in the last 2 years, quite simply, is that because of world action, the UN Security Council resolutions, and because of military force. And that's why I did support the pre-deployment of Australian US military personnel and hardware, and that's why I do support that action. But I say that today we stand here at a critical time in our history. It is a watershed event. I accept that and agree with that point, but I say that inaction is simply not an option. Inaction in terms of withdrawing our troops at this vital time can only provide victory to Saddam Hussein. It will provide victory to terrorists. It will provide victory to rogue states. That is simply not an option. If we withdraw now, think of the people of Iraq. The people of Iraq, the innocent men and women and children who have suffered unfairly and in an awful manner over so many years under this wretched regime. They've been gassed, they've been tortured, they have been promulgated and hurt personally and in every way. I say that if we can't deal with this issue vis-a-vis Iraq today, then what hope have we got of dealing with other terrorist or rogue states tomorrow. And I simply raise the issue of the North Korea. What hope have we got to deal with North Korea? Our ability in that regard will be deficient. Both Iraq and North Korea present grave security concerns for this nation. Both have pursued weapons of mass destruction in breach of their international obligations. Each case warrants treatment on its merits with the tools and means available to the international community. Australia is addressing both these important international issues in ways most appropriate to the circumstances in each case. And I compliment Alexander Downer in particular in that regard, and of course the Prime Minister. North Korea is undoubtedly influenced by the decision-making process of the international community in relation to Iraq. This is a key juncture in global history. If the international community is ultimately unprepared to show unity in disarming Saddam Hussein in Iraq, North Korea can see for itself the limitation of international resolve in dealing with weapons of mass destruction, and its approach will be influenced by that. Disarming Iraq and making unacceptable the acquisition of weapons of mass destruction by other countries will send a powerful signal to North Korea. So that is the key. Withdrawal now is simply not an option. I've mentioned September 11 and October 12, and I want to just read a quote from Greg Craven, who said this recently in the Financial Review. At least since September 11, but probably before, we have lived in a different world. The danger to our security is not from an attack by some rival superpower. The real threat is from an ever-changing mosaic of connection between brutal rogue states and terrorist movements, whose interactions are invisible and whose attacks are unpredictable. We now live in a new world order. This is the paradigm shift that has occurred. Greg Craven goes on to say this: what would be the result if the US was to turn away now, defeated and humiliated? Critics of the US would rejoice in its embarrassment and France would hum the Marseillaise. But rogue states and terrorist rogues around the world would sing a different song. And of course, this is my comments here, Saddam Hussein of course would be celebrating, and he would be heartened beyond measure by this. He would be the victor, as I've indicated. To continue the quote, they would discern that the democratic world was paralysed in the face of its own misgivings and divisions from dealing with real and present danger. Like apt pupils, they would learn the obvious lesson. Only a fool wants war, but you do not have to be a fool to accept that we're going to have to fight one. And that's the end of the quote. I notice in today's Australian a very thoughtful article by William Shawcross, and I'd like to read from his quote where he says, "All wars have unintended and unexpected consequences, but the flip side is also true. When all other avenues have been tried, war sometimes becomes the necessary last resort. To flinch from it becomes far more dangerous than to accept its dreadful inevitability, as we learned between 1933 and 1939. And my colleague, the Honourable Senator Ross Lightfoot, highlighted that time of appeasement very eloquently during his speech just previously, before myself. The French would, to continue the quote, the French would like us to believe we are rushing into war. Nonsense. For 12 years Hussein has defied UN demands that we hand over and destroy his biological, chemical and nuclear weapons programs. They have been 12 years of humiliation for the UN. In the words of Britain's Foreign Minister Jack Straw, 12 years in which the international community has failed to enforce its own laws against one of the vilest dictators on earth. Now that's a reflection on us. That's a reflection, and a sad one, on the international community as a result of the inaction of the last 12 years. And now it's come to this. Yes, it is late, and sadly a late time, but it is never too late for action, and that's what's happening here. So I would like to also congratulate the Prime Minister Tony Blair on his recent speech and on his stand, his credibility. And he's, as Senator Alan Eggleston said, he is a great man standing up for his country, for his beliefs, for the freedoms of this world. And it is sad that the members on the other side and the senators in this chamber cannot acknowledge the great stand from a Labor Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He said this in his quote. He said, "Because the outcome of this issue will now determine more than the fate of the Iraqi regime and more than the future of the Iraqi people for so long brutalised by Saddam. It will determine the way Britain and the world confront the central security threat of the 21st century, the development of the UN, the relationship between Europe and the US, the relations within the EU and the way the US engages with the rest of the world. It will determine the pattern of international politics for the next generation." And that applies to the world community and it applies to Australia. And I just think this is a watershed event in global community history, in global political history. And Prime Minister Blair has summed that up so well. And we all should learn from history and the lessons, particularly in that period prior to the Second World War. I just note that in the last 2 years there have been some 2,000 separate terrorist incidents causing loss of life of thousands of lives over in the world community, and this is tragic indeed, and this is something that we are now in this new world order where insecurity reigns, and we must do something about it. The world has to learn the lesson all over again that weakness in the face of a threat from a tyrant is the surest way not to peace but to war. And what a great statement and an appropriate lesson for all of us. Looking back over 12 years, we have been victims of our own desire to placate the implacatable, to persuade towards reason the utterly unreasonable, to hope that there was some genuine intent to do good in a regime whose mind is in fact evil. Now the very length of time counts against us. You've waited 12 years, why not wait a little longer? And indeed we have. Well, it is time now for action. It is time for action. Insecurity is spreading throughout the world like a vibrant cancer. We've come face to face with this on October 12, as I said, with the Bali bombing. We cannot, as an Australian nation, roll ourselves up into a little ball, as the Prime Minister so eloquently put it after the Bali bombing. We cannot pretend that there is no tyranny out there. We cannot deny the insecurity and terror that runs rife in the world. Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. They have chemical and biological weapons. If they, and this deadly cocktail, if those weapons get into the hands of terrorists or rogue states, that is a fear which drives my thinking on this issue and wants me to protect the future for my children and the children throughout this country, because we are moving into very worrying times, and that deadly cocktail is nigh. Terror is the enemy, not just the act, but the fear in the hearts of each of us. The removal of the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda network in Afghanistan was right. The United States-led coalition was moved to make that happen, was correct. It was one step to ridding the world of terror. It was not just a war. We're not facing just a war against Iraq. We are facing, as I've coined the phrase, a war against Iraqism. And I highlight that. And I want to make this point too, that this is not a war against Islam. And the Prime Minister's made that, many senators and members on this side of the House have made that point. And we have Muslim communities in Australia, of course, and we want to care and protect and look after their interests, like all Australian citizens. But it is not a war against Islam, and that point, Islam's point, was made by the Prime Minister when he came back after his recent world tour to the US, the UK. He came back via Indonesia for a very sensible and appropriate reason, to assure President Sukarno Putri of that point. And yes, there's an agreement to disagree there between the two leaders of our nations in respect to the appropriateness of war in Iraq. But what is agreed and accepted by the Indonesian leader is that this is not a war against Islam. So it is a fight, firstly, I think, in my view, for the people and liberation of the people of Iraq. It is a fight for freedom and for others around the world. And it is not, these are the things that we should not take for granted. You see, when we are proactive as leaders, wherever we are, criticism will follow. When you are a leader and you stand up for something, we realise this in politics, you are criticised. And that's why I just want to take my hat off and congratulate the Prime Minister for his courage, for his steadfastness, for his determined attitude and willingness to lead this nation because of what he believes is 100% right. Never, in my view, have we seen a man for the moment, but at a time like this, Mr Howard is the man to lead Australia and to make that decision, and I'm so proud of him and the leadership team in this coalition government. And I admire him and the work that he's been doing under great stress when you see protesters outside his own home here in Canberra. It really pains me to the core when he does that. He is not, as some people say, a warmonger. Nothing could be more from the truth. But we are now at a special moment of Australian history. So I want to say, let's not take for granted the need to remove apathy, and we need to have a renewed vigour to say thank you, God, for this blessed country that we have, for the freedoms that we have to love and to care and to share and to vote and to speak and to debate and to protest. And as a point that was made by Senator Lightfoot, and I'm going to make it again because there was a citizen of Iraq who protested, who expressed a view contrary to Saddam Hussein just in the last few days. What happened to him? He had his tongue cut out. He was mutilated and held up to a pole for example there in Saddam Hussein's own country. That's the type of regime that we're up against, and that's the type of freedom, the freedoms that we have in this country to stand up and to protest and to express a different view. We will fight to the death to protect those freedoms, and that's only appropriate, not only for us but for others around this great globe, this world in which we live. Let's see this event as a cause for the stirring in our bosom as a nation, to be thankful for the privileges that we have to grow and to earn money and to work and to seek satisfaction in our work, and to say thanks for a strong health and education system and a strong welfare system. Let's express those views and make those points clear. Yes, the legal argument has been put in recent days regarding the appropriateness of this war. But look, I'm not going to go into all those points of view. They've been covered quite clearly, but I see those as not primary but secondary issues. I highlight and mention Greg Hunt's article just in the last few days in the media, where he says, of course it would be preferable to have further resolution for purposes of unanimity. Such a resolution would be the best way of avoiding conflict, but Australia, Britain, Spain and the US have exhausted every avenue to achieve moral support of the 18th resolution. However, France, while calling for UN solidarity, has at the same time categorically ruled out any further resolution authorising force. It has blocked the very avenue down which it wants the world to travel. Make no mistake, though, full authority to enforce Resolution 1441 already exists. It does exist. There is legal authority, and I'm not going to go into it. The other resolutions that are relevant are 678, 687 and, as I've said, 1441, and they're all passed under Chapter 7 of the Charter of the United Nations. There are many other reasons for the disarming of Iraq. and many other commentators have supported it. But I want to say in the final moments that it does highlight also the importance of the credibility of the UN, and this US-led coalition.
Your time has expired.